Deep in the Reads here to once again talk about a book that you may or may not have heard of before. And I'm also specifically trying to highlight the author that wrote this book, one of Africa's most famous novelists who just passed away a couple months ago. I've talked about him on this channel before. His name is Ngũgĩ wa Thiong'o. Thiong'o was a Kenyan author who got his start in the early 60s, right as Kenya was gaining its independence from the British after 10 plus years of revolutionary struggle and civil strife. So, Thiong'o's main themes in his novels are things like colonialism, Kenya's budding sense of national consciousness, and his native Gikuyu culture. He was also quite the activist in his life. He was quite critical of some of the post-colonial governments in Kenya, and even ended up in prison for a year when some of his more critical plays and novels got censored, and there was a big deal about that. So he's also written memoirs about his time in prison as an activist. He's written non-fiction books about anti-colonial struggles and independence movements throughout Africa. So just a very important voice to these movements. So when I heard that Thiong'o died, I decided I want to read another one of his books. I took a chance on one of his earliest novels called A Grain of Wheat, which came out just 3 or 4 years after Uhuru, or Kenya's independence. So the book is very much a response to this independence and all of the hopes and fears of the people in Kenya. The book opens just as Kenya is about to officially gain its independence from the British. The revolution was won months ago, and it's been decided that there's going to be an official day where the British are all going to get the fuck out of Kenya and transfer power to the Kenyans. So this is just a week away. There's going to be celebrations all over Kenya, and in one small village of Thabai, they've planned a ceremony that revolves all around a local hero named Mugo. Mugo is a very reclusive guy who's been even worse since he came back from a British concentration camp as a political prisoner. You quickly find out that he feels like he's completely undeserving of the honor. He wants nothing to do with the ceremony. He just wants to forget and move on. The story rapidly spreads out from Mugo as you're introduced to a whole host of characters and their complex interlocking pasts, as well as their differing views on the independent Kenya that's about to happen. This first chunk of the book, where you're getting introduced to everything, is a little bit overwhelming. I felt like I was getting whiplash trying to keep the characters and their connections straight in my head. Not only are you introduced to Kenyan characters, but British ones as well. And given the fact that Britain has done some really terrible things to Kenya, the British characters are treated fairly sympathetically, which was pretty refreshing after reading Devil on the Cross by this author. In Devil on the Cross, the good guys and the bad guys have this very sharp line drawn between who is who, almost to a cartoonish extent, but in A Grain of Wheat, it's much more interested in shades of grey. The writing style in this book is pretty simplistic. I would almost say it's like it's written for a young audience, if not for the fact that the subject matter is quite dark in places and there's a lot of sexual humor. It manages to be subtly poetic and almost like a fable without being too flowery. It also has this unique structure to it where you're jumping between past and present a lot, but you never really see the war. Everything is set either after or before the war, and the few parts that are set during the war stick to the villages or life in prison as opposed to showing you any of the combat. Yet, in spite of that, this book can be really harrowing in places, especially when you see the way that the British treated the Kenyans. It had a lot of parallels to modern imperialism. The destruction and displacement of villages in this book is identical to Israel's brutal occupation of the West Bank of Palestine, and I also noticed a lot of parallels to the apartheid system of South Africa. Although there was definitely a lot to appreciate in the first few chapters, I couldn't help but feel frustrated. Like I said, there was a lot of jumping around, and it made it hard for me to really get hooked into the story. I just wanted it to focus. And I got my wish in chapter 7, because that's the point where the story takes a huge shift and gives you longer and more focused chapters, which delve into the past of a few key characters before the war displaced everything and all of that. So suddenly you're dropped into this love triangle with this woman named Mumbi and these two men named Gikonyo and Karanja, and she also has these two brothers who are pulled in opposite directions by the revolution. So you get invested in this family drama as the war looms, and suddenly the men start to feel this call of action where they want to stand up for Kenya against the British. This is where the book really took a positive turn, and I started to really love what I was reading. The story basically becomes a build-up to the Uhuru celebration as you learn about the characters in this village, how they relate to Mugo, and what their role was in the Revolutionary War. You get secret betrayals, shifting allegiances, unrequited loves, all intermingled with personal and political conflict. You start to see through the idealism of the revolution, because the heroes that took part in it weren't these mythical, perfect heroes. They were just regular people who often had to compromise who they were in order to survive and get what they wanted. Sometimes they even had to collaborate with the British. So all of this is treated, again, in a pretty sympathetic way, which would have been very impactful at the time this book came out. Instead of take this very one-sided black and white view of what side a person happened to fall on, instead the book looks forward to things like forgiveness and reconciliation, which is something that South Africa tried to do 30 years later when it gained its own independence. Thiong'o is also quite daring when it comes to addressing and criticizing his own cultural values, especially the intense gender roles throughout the book. The women are relegated mostly to domestic life, while the men are very much elevated. Masculinity is super important, and they are hyper-vigilant against any perceived slight and ready to fight for their honor. If a woman so much as disagrees with them, you'll get internal monologue, like, oh, I just want to beat the shit out of her right now. And unfortunately, that domestic violence does play out a few times in the book. These motifs around sexism and domestic violence are a lot more uncomfortable when you learn that Thiong'o used to beat his wife. I totally understand if that's something that makes you not want to pick up a book by him. But for my part, I learned about this just as I was starting this book, and I pushed into it anyway and found that it almost seemed like he was at an inner conflict with himself, because obviously the sexism and domestic violence is treated in a pretty negative way throughout the book. So maybe it's that he recognized it in himself, but it definitely seems like there is some internal conflict going on when you read this book with that in the back of your mind. This idea of inner conflict and failing to live up to your own virtues is a motif that is all over this book. All of the characters are very conflicted. They have these dark pasts where they've done some really bad stuff. And the book is basically asking if they can be redeemed and find a path forward. And by extension, if Kenya can have those things as well. So by doing that, Thiong'o is taking this nation of millions and making its massive conflict feel intensely personal. This is something that I really realized when I found out that Mumbi is the name of a Kenyan creator god, which completely changed the way that I framed her interactions and much of the story, because suddenly it's saying that the way that she's been treated by the people around her on different sides of this conflict is the way that people themselves have treated Kenya and pulled it in one direction or the other. So it gave me a lot to reflect on and definitely had big implications for the end of the book. It leaves you with these lingering questions about what the best path forward is for the country. Should they pursue vengeance or forgiveness? How do they reconcile the trauma of the past and their own roles in it? How do they look at their own culture and perspectives and change them in order to forge the best path forward? I think this is a really solid introduction to Kenyan literature. I would give it a 7 out of 10. It's a bit rough at the start, and it has some structural issues. I also think some of Thiong'o's problems with women crop up a little bit in the story, but overall, it's my favorite African novel that I've read so far. I've only read 3, so that's not saying much, but yeah, I hope I can convince some people to check this book out, or anything by African authors, because there's a whole continent of literature out there that a lot of people haven't explored, so why don't you make it a point and explore it yourself? Have you read A Grain of Wheat or anything else by Ngũgĩ wa Thiong'o? How did you feel when you found out he died? I don't know, but I would love to hear from you. So, thank you for watching. I've been Deep in the Reads. Hope you've enjoyed the video, and I will see you next time.